But first up, just a few seconds ago, the British Horse Racing Authority released the update, the annual update from its Diversity in Racing Steering Group. And just to take us through the ramifications and implications of that, I'm really pleased to welcome for the first time to the Luck on Sunday studio the head of the Diversity in Racing Steering Group, Rose Grissell, who's been in the job, what, about a year now, Rose?
Yeah, that's right.
And how have you found it? How are you finding it?
Well, fantastic role. It's really great to work in racing. I've been involved with racing my whole life, but from not a career base. So it's fantastic to be in the role, and it's been a really positive year so far. We've made some good progress, but now a really exciting position of where we are at the moment.
We'll come to some of the gains that you've made in the last year in a few moments' time. But let's talk about this action plan, because it has just been released in the last few seconds. The Diversity in Racing Steering Group was set up in 2017. You were brought on board a year ago. The action plan now moving forward. What are the key strategic points that you're picking up for the year ahead?
So the action plan across the whole of racing was actually published in July last year, and this is an annual update really to highlight some of the benefits to racing, as well why we feel that diversity and inclusion could be really beneficial to racing, but also to give a bit of a review of what we've been doing the last year, as well as to setting out the plans and our kind of more of a strategic direction for the next year or so. So the action plan was so broad across the whole sport. We've now got to a position where we've got you know, some key priorities that are our initial deliverables, because obviously we can't achieve everything overnight. So we've got those set now. Let's
take them one by one. First key area, raising awareness for the importance of diversity and inclusion across racing through industry-wide events and a digital awareness and engagement campaign. Just give me an idea of some of those industry-wide events and how that's going to manifest itself.
Yeah, so this is really from a point of view that to drive this area forward, we really need a really collaborative approach across the whole sport. This can't just be led by the BHA or different stakeholders. Actually, everyone has a role to play. So a lot of the work we've been doing across the last year has been to engage industry stakeholders into the conversation, why it's important for racing to focus on this area and how it can benefit racing as well. And we want to continue to do that. So having different events to educate and raise awareness, but also to empower the industry to take their own responsibilities to say how they can drive this agenda forward as well.
So what type of events are we looking at?
Well, we're looking at you know, I guess engagement events. They might be just anyone to get people together to have that conversation, start the conversation, get ideas together on different subjects, whatever that may be. You know, we've got a number of different elements under the umbrella of diversity and inclusion. It's a very broad subject, so actually the events will be focusing on specific things and looking to see how we can start the conversation, to see where the actions may be from that.
OK, and collating and evaluating cross-industry diversity data, publishing where possible to build a clear evidence base for decisions. Is that trying to understand the makeup of the sport's constituents, the makeup of the people who come into horse racing, and how do you go about getting that data?
Well, that's the big question, really. So we believe that with all these things, you really have to monitor what you're doing to ensure you're actually making an impact, you're making progress. I mean, currently the data with regard to diversity and inclusion across the sport is limited to a degree because no one's really looked at it before. So we want to do a piece of work to establish what currently exists, identifying some of the gaps, you know, what are the issues. We have good data around female jockeys, for example, to some degree, but with regard to looking at ethnicity in the sport, we have no data on that at the moment. So that piece of work will be looking across the board to see how we can collect that information.
So you have no idea, as things stand, the makeup of a race day crowd, for example, in terms of their ethnicity.
Yeah, so obviously we can make assumptions, but there's never been a substantial piece of work to actually understand that. We know it's an issue because you can go to a racecourse and have a look. But we feel that if we're able to start to monitor things, we can then start to set targets and start to really monitor the progress that we make as an industry.
I mean, and how will you do that? What are the mechanics of doing that?
Well, that's what we have to work out. So it might be through, one-off pieces of work every few years, or it might be starting to embed collecting information through the tools that we have in place at the moment through licenses, for example. So that's what we have to work out, and we'll be working with an external kind of agency to establish how we go about doing that.
Your third plank is looking at ways to create a culture of inclusivity in racing through the development and publishing of best practice toolkits and case studies for the industry, as well as aligning with wider campaigns such as Stonewall's Rainbow Laces. Let's just talk about the culture of inclusivity in racing. What do you think the culture in racing is at the moment, from the perspective of your role?
I think it depends on who you talk to be honest. I think people who work in the industry have, or the majority of people, I would say, feel that there is a really big racing family. It's quite... people very much look out for each other. You can have that real team spirit in a yard where everyone is part of, getting that win, making sure your horse is, being the best it can be. However, maybe from outside, from certain communities, it may not feel like an inclusive environment. If potentially there may be barriers around cost, or even dressing up to go on the racecourse. There's been a piece of research done recently around from the wider public, looking at perceptions of racing, and it's soon to be released. But one of the key things that identified was the fact that it's seen as exclusive, elitist to a degree. So that's kind of the kind of thing that we need to learn from and address, and see to think, how can we adapt and see that we are welcoming to all, because it is, from an internal point of view, we feel it's very inclusive. How
do you think we can adapt? I mean, you've now been in the role a year, so you must have gathered so many different thoughts from so many different people, and it's very difficult to kind of draw all these strands together. But for you, how do you think the sport can adapt?
I think there are lots of little things that we can do. And I think it's almost slightly just changing the language, changing the conversation to broaden our sport to a wider population. We're not reaching as many people as we could do. I mean, we've seen some fantastic stories already in 2019 demonstrating how our diverse participants are kind of reaching new audiences. So if you think about some of the main media stories that hit mainstream media outside of the racing media this year, we've got Bryony Frost and Paisley Park with trained by Emma Lavelle and owned by Andrew Gemmell at Cheltenham. That was a hugely positive story. Had Hayley Turner at Ascot, and of course Khadija Mella. All these stories were really positive stories for racing that hit the newspapers outside of racing, which were interesting for people who may not have actually otherwise raised an eyelid to an eyebrow to racing before.
But in essence, doesn't racing have to be in a position whereby, for example, Khadija Mella, woman from minority ethnic background, is riding a winner, albeit in a charity race, whereby Bryony Frost is emblematic not just of somebody succeeding against the odds, but representative of a whole raft of women who are doing extremely well in the sport? Isn't one of the reasons that these have garnered so much media coverage is because they are, not one-offs, but they are unusual events where, in fact, you want to make them usual events? And if they are usual events, are they guaranteed to get the same amount of media coverage?
Potentially not, but at the moment we're seeing huge interest in women's sport, in society. The biggest viewing figures of the Women's World Cup, and also we're seeing investment in that area, huge sponsorship in women's sport at the moment. So in the current climate of things, I think there is a real interest in these female participants from the wider public. So I think it's a real opportunity for racing at the moment, and we should really take it.
And I guess it's your job then to pick up on these stories, to pick up on mainstream media interest, and then try and work out how to parlay that into widespread interest in the sport. And that's the difficulty, isn't it? It's how you convert a little bit of interest on any given day to something that's more widespread or deeper rooted. Yeah,
so I mean, as you said, those stories are fantastic, but actually, to make them more often or more common, we need to work with the industry to actually change some of the current, potentially kind of outdated attitudes that exist, to see if we can, or maybe not just attitudes, but just the reality of how things are, to see if we can make more of them.
Do you think there are still outdated attitudes within the sport?
I think they do exist, yes. But of course, we have to celebrate the fact that things are really getting better. Women have only been riding in races for 50 years or so. And, we've seen an upward trend of more professional female jockeys for the last 10 years and them getting more rides. So, that trend is a really positive one that we need to make more of. But at the same time, there is still huge disparity between male and female jockeys. So we need to look at that and understand more of it and see what we can do.
And do you feel that you've got your own mechanics in place to be able to support your ideas? You've clearly got a lot of ideas, but it's a question of then having the financial and pragmatic support to push that through. Do you feel you have that?
Yeah, so that's what we've been working hard on for the last year or so. We've been doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes to, as I say, engage some key industry stakeholders. We've got kind of the first phase plan in place now, and we're really lucky to secure funding from the Racing Foundation to deliver the key actions within that first phase. So we're in a really strong position now to actually make some, or accelerate progress, I would say, to kind of push things forward. And we're also being supported by the Members Committee now, the diversity group is being supported by the Members Committee, so has that oversight and accountability from racecourses as well as key participants within the sport, which is a really strong position for us.
If you were to say that there'd been one key victory for the Diversity in Racing Steering Group over the last year since you've been involved, what would it be?
I think it probably is to secure the funding from the Racing Foundation. As with all these things, and in the industry and in other industries as well, funding is a challenge, and in a complex sport like racing, it's fundamental to enable us to deliver some key activities and actually to make some progress. So now we have that and a clear direction and vision going forward for the next year. Hopefully we can start to see some implemented changes or initiatives, whatever that may be, or at least some research and evidence to help us get a clearer plan of what they may be.
You must have in your own mind, not easy wins, but you must have in your own mind things that you'd like to see in the sport that aren't there at the moment. And tell me a few of those. So in a couple of years, if you came back here and said, look, this is what we've done. We've got more of X, more of Y, and less of Z. What would those things be?
It's a tricky one to pinpoint, but I think one of our fourth kind of key objective is around female jockeys, and I think that's got the most momentum at the moment. So I think if we're able to look back in a couple of years and say, oh, actually look at the progress that has been made. And we do sit here now and say, oh my God, look at the progress that has been made in the last few years. So we're
making the unusual usual. Yeah.
Exactly. And fundamentally, I'd like, us to be progressing so far that in effect my job becomes a bit redundant, because diversity and inclusion should be an element that's embedded in everything that we do. So it should become the norm, really, as opposed to sitting aside as a separate area.
But your job can never become redundant, because the sport always has to be an inclusive sport.
Exactly.
Even if that jockeys table was made up 50-50 of men and women, it still has to be an inclusive sport all round, doesn't it? Everyone needs to feel involved and enfranchised.
But it should be, so rather than my own role being redundant, maybe there are multiple of me working across the industry in different areas.
Well, one of you is just grand for the moment, Rose Grissell. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us and talking us through this plan, and I wish you the very best of luck with it.
Cool, thanks for having me.
Not at all. Rose Grissell, the BHA's Head of Diversity and Inclusion. Subscribe to Racing TV to be notified when more Luck on Sunday videos are appearing online. And don't forget to join me for the show every Sunday morning from 9 o'clock with the best guests.